We're going to go ahead and dive in. So if you're new to our organization, just kind of wanted to give some brief background about who Serve Virginia is. Our purpose is really to convene, connect, and mobilize. So in addition to overseeing AmeriCorps state programming and resources and supporting national service members in Virginia, we really care about how this work all comes together. And by this work, I mean service, volunteerism, meeting critical community needs. We know that this takes everybody coming together to make a tangible impact. And so we're excited to support folks like you, nonprofit organizations, government organizations, federal and non-federal entities to kind of think through how we might be able to provide training and technical assistance to promote service and volunteerism, how we can collaborate strategically to make sure that our sector kind of continues to innovate and move forward. And then what we're here to talk about today is specifically utilizing and leveraging national service resources as a way to get things done. So just for context, about over 200,000 people and millions of dollars goes out through AmeriCorps programming every year. And so just wanting to make kind of getting the most bang for our buck out of national service programming, and then also offering those opportunities to Virginians so that we can have a strong sector that continues to have great experience and innovates and meets critical needs kind of moving forward. So we're going to start off with just a very brief overview about AmeriCorps. I see lots of familiar faces that probably know kind of the intro spiel, but wanting to make sure that we're all on the same page. When we talk about AmeriCorps, we're talking about the people power that's used to tackle critical community needs. AmeriCorps members and AmeriCorps senior volunteers are what we call national service members. They volunteer directly with a program or organization to meet critical community needs in the areas of education, environmental stewardship, disaster relief and preparedness, serving veterans and military families, education, and promoting healthy futures. And so every year, more than 200,000 individuals step up in some way, whether that's for a short period of time, maybe serving 20 hours a week for 6 weeks, all the way up to serving 40 hours a week for an entire year to commit to making a difference. We find that these AmeriCorps members represent kind of all ages and backgrounds, and that this is really a great learning and training experience for folks that want to kind of get that hands-on skill development in the nonprofit sector or in some sort of public programming. So AmeriCorps members they commit to a service term or a year of service. They are often providing either direct service or capacity building support to organizations. And then in return, they're gaining skills, experience, connections, and then they also receive benefits like a living allowance and an education award based on their service to kind of support them in their future journeys. The AmeriCorps programs that engage these members are organizations that step up to say, we want to help leverage this people power and use this funding to develop and expand community impact. So this is about expanding and enhancing community services, kind of thinking about how we can take what we do above and beyond and really kind of stretch and grow our impact so that we can start making tangible moving the needle, making a tangible difference in some of these statistics that we know are kind of that show up in people's lives every day. And so really wanting to kind of invest in changing the landscape, right? And so over 2,000 partners nationwide host AmeriCorps members in a variety of different ways, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. But we find that this is a really rich network of organizations that have said, I want to be part of the change. And so we're excited to count you as part of that. There are about 6 different ways you can serve in AmeriCorps, and so we'll save you kind of the nitty-gritty details of all of them. I will say that 3 of them focus on engaging seniors. So if engaging folks 55 and up is a part of your organization's mission and vision, let us know. We'd be happy to talk with you more offline about AmeriCorps seniors opportunities. We also have AmeriCorps Vista and AmeriCorps NCCC, which provide capacity building support to organizations that are looking to fight poverty or address stewardship and renewal needs in their communities. And we can talk more about that as well if folks have questions. But today we're really focusing on AmeriCorps State. AmeriCorps State uses direct service, so engaging AmeriCorps members in providing a direct service to community members across those focus areas to really start making an impact in these focus areas so that we can see change develop. So any kind of, I know I talk really fast because I get really excited about this, but I just wanted to kind of pause for a second and see if there were any questions about sort of AmeriCorps in general before we move into AmeriCorps State more specifically. Doesn't look like anything has come through in the chat. But again, feel free to put questions there and we will sort of address them if we can as we go along and or save those to the end. So I'm excited to pass it off to my colleague Samantha to talk more specifically about AmeriCorps state programs.
Alrighty, thank you, Annalise. So my name is Samantha. I'm the AmeriCorps manager here at Serve Virginia. And essentially my job is working with our portfolio of programs that we subgrant out to. And we have a couple of program officers who help our individual subgrantees through their year of planning grant or an operational grant, which I'll touch on in a bit. But I also run the request for applications process. So we're going to talk about intermediaries specifically. If you want to go to the next slide, there's a number of different program models when we talk about getting an operational or planning grant and having AmeriCorps boots on the ground in your community. But the federal agency, we're considered a pass-through entity. So we get a formula of funds from AmeriCorps, the federal agency. Then we run a competitive process each spring and grant out formula dollars, so federal dollars, to an organization, you essentially, your organization. And then there's different ways in which you can utilize that funding, and whether it's through partners, which we're going to talk about, or the money can stay, at your organization, and you can have AmeriCorps members serving with you. So if we want to go to the next slide, I'll just give you a couple of examples. One organization that we currently fund is Edifatoro, and they're in Nova. They're not considered an intermediary program. They have members who are serving just at their organization within their own programs. I think Susan asked if they can get the slides. Yes, right? Great. So they applied for funding. I believe they're in their third year of formula funding. They used to be a service site at a different nonprofit that we fund. And then they matured in a way, gained their own capacity, and then applied for a separate grant. So they have a separate program now and they have two different focus areas. So Annalise very briefly touched that there's different ways and different focus areas that your program can fit into, and we would help you through that process and what your performance would look like. But they have programs in education and economic opportunity that they are currently doing at their own organization. And then they place members in their youth programs and their adult programs. So that's just one model of how you can utilize AmeriCorps members at your organization. If you want to go to the next one. Another organization that we fund, Literacy Lab, they have members serving, I believe, in the Newport News area, in Danville, and the Richmond area. And they focus on one thing. They focus on education. They would be considered an intermediary because essentially what an intermediary is like what we traditionally call like an anchor organization who has the capacity to administer this large federal grant. And so they're not placing members at their organization. They're basically like an administrative organization that works and partners with different school districts. And it's very centralized. They are only doing education. They're only working with partners who are in the school system. It's very, tight model. That's really successful, but they would be considered an intermediary because they're not placing members at their own organization. They're working with their partners and identifying school districts. They're getting to MOUs, memorandums of understanding, with school districts to place members there. So they're working with principals, guidance counselors, different, boards and supervisors to place members in different districts. We're going to go to the next one. And then another example, which I think a lot of people think of when they think of what an intermediary model looks like, is the city of Richmond. We currently fund them in two programs. They have a public health AmeriCorps program, which would also be considered an intermediary model, and they have their Our Hopes program. And their Our Hopes that's just what they call their program, is focused on healthy futures, economic opportunity, and I think actually environmental stewardship as well, which is not pictured here. So they work on three focus areas, and they work with outside organizations outside the city. They also do place members with the city in their parks department, but they're working with opioid and substance use disorder organizations like McShin, Rams in Recovery, St. Joseph's Village. So they're vetting their partners based on whatever criteria they're putting out. And sometimes they do an application, organizations can do an application to vet your partners, or if they're just natural partners that you've been working with for a while, it is important to have an agreement, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But they're placing members and training their partner sites to host members at their organizations. So what the city is doing the onboarding, the startup training for supervisors, identifying supervisors at each individual site, giving them a handbook, talking about policies, procedures, they're monitoring. There's no sub-grantee relationship with McShin and City of Richmond, but they're a partner, and they're like a true intermediary when you think about the model. Go to the next slide. I'm glad you'll get these slides. These are a number of things that have to happen when you have an AmeriCorps grant, and they're all working together, and no one piece necessarily belongs to when you partner with someone. Obviously, we're sub-granting to one organization, and when you are an intermediary, you are the organization that's receiving the contract, and then you are working with your partners to do a number of different things. So we're not contractually, Serve Virginia is not contracting with your partner site. We're only subcontracting with the organization, the anchor organization, and you all are receiving the grant. So there's different things that come with receiving a grant. I'm going to start here right in the top corner. So the financial management, the accounting, the budget development, the financial reports would all come from the intermediary agency. You might have a cost sharing agreement with your sub-site to provide match for the grant. That's strictly between your organization and the partner. So Virginia does not get involved in any agreements for cost share. The expense reports would come directly from the sub-granted organization, the intermediary. So records, files, member criminal history checks, member files would all be housed at the intermediary organization, the sub-grant of Virginia. And there's nothing to say that you can't partner with the organization to do different parts of these things, but that was strictly between you and your partner. Down to the bottom, member training and support and supervision. That's both of your responsibilities, right? So we ask that every member be assigned a supervisor, and it's not necessarily one-to-one. So if you have a cohort of 5 members serving at one site, they can have one supervisor, but they need to be identified. And if you have a program director at the intermediary, they obviously are not supervising the member at the host site. So that's an agreement between you and your site about what that looks like. If we go over to the right side or left side, excuse me, continuous improvement, program design, measurement improvement, program design, member slot, site management, things that yes, come directly to us from the intermediary through their application. But it is also, and we'll go to the next slide in a minute, is also it's a partnership. So you guys should be coming up with your program design. What does that look like on the ground? What does the agreement look like? What are we trying to measure here? What are we trying to achieve as a community, etc. So if you want to go to the next slide. So all partners should be brought into when you're thinking about doing an intermediary. If you're thinking like my organization is really small, our budget is relatively small, we have a lot of half-time staff, we only have one full-time director, can we take this on? Or does it make more sense for us to partner with a larger organization? I'm trying to think like the city, I mean, that's kind of a special because they're a local government, but if there's a other nonprofit in your community who has the capacity, like a Feeding America, like if you're a small food pantry or something, and there's an organization like Feeding America, then they obviously have the capacity to do it. Not that they're going to sign on to do it, but we can always talk to them about that. But all partners should be brought in and at the table when talking about the purpose of the program. Like you saw the other slides, an intermediary doesn't only have to focus on like education or environment. They can focus on multiple different things. I was a director in Roanoke at a nonprofit who was an intermediary, and we focused on education, healthy futures, economic opportunity. So we had different organizations that fit within those categories that we helped place members at. So I think at any one point in time, we had 20 members who were at, I think, 15 different organizations, which was at the height of our grant. So agreeing that, about the AmeriCorps mission, because obviously this is an AmeriCorps program. And so understanding that the organizations are not just getting like cheap labor, right? This is a movement. We're trying to do something here. So understanding, service is part of this. And then realizing why it's important to your community. So just having a general understanding between each other about why it's important. So down here, successful programs provide clear expectations, guidelines, training, etc. For the program's overall purpose. Do you want to go to the next slide? So planning for success. I think I touched on this a little bit. So site selection process. A lot of this stuff happens organically. When I was in Roanoke, we were a nonprofit that helped other nonprofits. So we had a mission and a vision, obviously, but some of the organizations didn't necessarily fit succinctly within our mission. So we did do a concept paper round where we were like, okay, we think AmeriCorps is an awesome solution to community issues. Who's interested in the program? And so based on our, different resources we sent out and contacts, sent out concept paper. It was only 2 pages. It says, what's your need? Why do you think AmeriCorps is a great fit for your organization? What can they do? Do you have resources to put towards this program? Because there needs to be some buy-in. What support do you have? What kind of capacity to handle how many members? And then we would just vet them and have a discussion, and then incorporate them into our grant. So there's also a piece called site monitoring. So we monitor Serve Virginia. Our relationship is obviously with the subgrantee, and we monitor you. But you should be constantly monitoring your sub sites to make sure that they're utilizing their members in an appropriate way. Go to the next slide. So there's 2 opportunities that are on the table right now. We're opening our RFA, our request for applications, starting February 1st. And we have planning grants available and operational. Go to the next slide. So planning grants are for 12 months. And hopefully we've talked to a lot of you on this call about that. They go from 75,000 to 240,000. And they exist to help you build the framework of your AmeriCorps program. I've had discussions with folks about, okay, if we have a planning grant, does that mean we have to have an operational grant at the end of our planning grant? And the answer is no. It doesn't contractually obligate you to have an AmeriCorps program if you discover like there's no partners, I'm not on the same page, this AmeriCorps program's too much, or it's not really a good fit, and I think we want to do AmeriCorps Vista or an AmeriCorps UCCC or AmeriCorps Seniors. It's building the framework for, okay, understanding a budget, an AmeriCorps budget, which can sometimes be a little tricky, understanding the policies and procedures that you have to have in order to run a successful program, understanding program design, and then incorporating the Virginia Community Index and our state service plan, something that we've developed here at Serve Virginia, and leveraging the data that we have into your programming and into your community. So it's a planning, and we have a scoped out planning agenda for the 12 months. So it's not just you and your organization and your partners trying to figure out on your own. It's a step-by-step, here's what we have to do, and here are your deliverables each month. If you want to go to the next one. So operational awards are for organizations who are ready to start September 1st, 2024. You're ready to recruit your members. You already have, internal controls. You already have the capacity to put the members on your payroll. You have cash flow for 2 to 3 months when you're setting up and waiting for your cost reimbursements. This is for like organizations who are ready to roll. There are not a lot of organizations who can just start up, and that's okay. That's why we have planning grants. But if you're ready to host with your partners or without at least 10 members, then I would, encourage you to apply for an operational grant. We do a negotiation stage, and so if your application doesn't meet certain criteria or your organization doesn't pass the risk assessment, then you wouldn't necessarily get funded. But there's an opportunity for you to maybe have a planning grant instead if you're not ready. I think that's the end of my slides. If anyone has any, okay, so this is just a visual representation of what we were just talking about. There, like for planning grants, you can apply, like I said, for 75K to 240K. And if you're thinking, oh my gosh, what would I do with all that money? Then definitely reach out to us and we can give you some ideas. In the RFA, the request for applications, which is going to be dropped, it does have some prescriptive measures that you need to include in your budget. same for operational grants. And operational grants in this series, we did go over how to build a budget, and I believe the cost premise Y is around 21,000 for a full-time member. So you have that to like apply for. Um, I don't know if Annalise, you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, that's all great information. I would just kind of on this side sort of use this as a visual representation of if you're still on the fence between a planning grant and an operational grant. So the planning grant is kind of asking, what's your community need? Why are you considering AmeriCorps? And why your organization is a player, like for lack of a better word, in this space. And so you can see that we're looking for organizations that are interested, that have an idea, but really need some time to flesh out what all this actually looks like as far as like member service and sites and a lot of the things that Sam talked about on that slide, the Venn diagram slide that talked about all the different things that you need to successfully manage an AmeriCorps program. We totally realize that does not come overnight. And so the planning grant is a great fit if you are excited by what we're talking about today, that you think that this could really help your community, and that you are invested in taking the next year to figure out what it looks like on the ground. If you are kind of like, yeah, I've got all this, I'm ready to go, then we can talk about the operational grant. But really what Samantha and I generally recommend is unless you are using a, pre-built program model, to really consider the planning grant opportunity, because it is a great experience to really take some time hand in hand with our staff, understanding AmeriCorps, understanding all the requirements, so that it's not something that you have to like all of a sudden, make overnight, that it's a process that you can really engage with, figure out how to make it work for your organization, figure out how to make it work for your members. And we're with you every step of the way. And we've got some really, I think, key tools like the Virginia Community Engagement Index that can help us get you really great support and situate yourself in your community in a way that when your AmeriCorps program is operational, it's ready to go and you've got everything that you need. And so just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about next steps. I will just kind of pause here and say, if you are excited by any of this, but totally overwhelmed, that is okay. There's a lot incorporated in AmeriCorps, but we think that it is still a really transformative process and a really great program to catalyze work that's being done on the community level. And this is really a great way to kind of take it to the next step. If you're at all interested in any of this, please set up a time to talk with me and Samantha, because we would love to talk with you more specifically about your context, more specifically about what you're interested in, so that we can make really specific recommendations for how you might get something like this started. If this makes sense and you've already talked with Samantha and I, then we would really urge you to consider applying for a planning grant. We think that the planning grant is a great opportunity to, like I said, start getting balls rolling and things happening at your organization. And that's where I would kind of point to this timeline. So between now and February 1st is a great time to talk with us about any questions that you have. So looking at at last year's RFA, which we will send out as a follow-up with these slides after this session, kind of thinking about what we asked for last year and what questions you might have about any of the required attachments, how to make an e-grants account, like anything like that. We would love to kind of provide that TA now before the RFA is published. Once the RFA is published, state procurement mandates, guidelines have us going quiet a little bit, right? We can't provide one-on-one technical support with applicants during a live application process, but we will have a pre-application conference call. That date and sign-up link will be published in the RFA. So we encourage you, when the RFA is released, we will email you and kind of take a look at that pre-application conference call so that you can get registered, and then you'll be able to ask any questions that you have live, and we'll be able to answer them directly and through a written kind of question and answer addenda that will be added to the RFA. I would plan on applications being due early March. Some of it will be based on the exact date that the RFA is published, but we're looking at that first full week of March. Successful applicants will be in touch with us in April, or that we will be in touch with you to kind of work through if there were any issues in your budget, if there were any errors in your application. We make sure to kind of get all that straight in April, and then letting folks know in May kind of what the status of their application is, with that, with some training happening over the summer, and your planning grant or your operational grant beginning September 1st. And we just put this out there to really kind of help you sort of think about what this can look like. If you were to do a planning grant, you would do planning grant trainings kind of that fall, and then be ready to apply for operational funding the following February, if that was something that you wanted to continue for continuous funding without any breaks. And we can talk again more about that during our one-on-one consultation. If you're excited and you've already talked to me and Sam and you're ready to, start considering your planning grant application, we will probably have already talked to you about if you're an eligible entity, but just in case you haven't seen that yet, any non-federal entity is eligible to apply. And so you can see that that's a pretty broad umbrella. It includes faith-based organizations. It includes nonprofits, local government, institutions. And so if you have any questions about the specificity, you can ask us and then we can take a look at the CFR together. You can also complete your SAM registration. This is a federal kind of, it'll give you a unique identifying number. This is way outside of my scope of knowledge, but it's something that you'll need for any federal grant. And so it's one of those things you can go ahead and get registered for that. And that doesn't mean that you have to then apply for our RFA or anything like that. But if you want to go ahead and just get your organization registered, so that's one less thing you have to worry about. Same with an eGrants account. You can go ahead and set up your organization's eGrants account on egrants.cns.gov. And then whether or not you choose to apply for this round of funding, at least that's something that's already taken care of. If you run into snags in either of those processes, now is also a great time to be able to ask us directly instead of having to go through procurement for us an easy question like, how do I get an eGrants account or something like that. So if you have any issues, let us know. If you are either already have those two things in place or are not worried about the tech aspects of it, I would also just encourage folks to be thinking about that lead applicant. So this does not have to be the person that's going to apply for operational funding for a future program. This just has to be who wants to monitor or who wants to manage the planning grant funding. This is oftentimes the organization with the most staff investment. This could be an organization that has the most capacity to manage a federal grant. Essentially, you will be fronting the staff costs on a month-by-month basis. So it does take about 3 or 4 weeks to get your reimbursement. So just kind of keeping that in mind. And again, let us know if you have questions. We're happy to chat with you about the fiscal elements of the planning grant itself before we dive into the actual building your budget for an operational grant. And then again, I said we'll send out the RFA from last year so that you'll be able to take a look at it and ask us questions. We'll provide you some cheat codes, right? Of like, go ahead and look at page 21 for this, and required attachments are listed on page 14. So we'll kind of get that out to you so that you can start some wheels turning, and you can ask us questions if something doesn't make sense. I will say that this upcoming RFA may look a little bit different than last year's RFA, but the content is going to be relatively similar. And so go ahead and use that as a base. And then we can at least tell you when you ask questions, oh yeah, don't worry about that. That might look different in next year's RFA, or like, yes, that's a pretty standard question and we can talk with you about how to answer them. So that is kind of it for our formal content. We specifically wanted to save a lot of time just to answer questions, comments, concerns. You will get the slides. You will get a copy of last year's RFA. We do have you add everyone who registered for today's webinar or has been a part of AmeriCorps 101 is on our friends list. So we will let you know when the RFA is released with the link to find the RFA and get all the information that you need. But we'd love to hear kind of what's on folks' minds. Any questions, comments, concerns? Love to just open it up.
Will this be sent out?
Yes, so this recording will be sent out with last year's RFA and the slides, and then we'll also be in touch around the RFA.
I appreciate it. I'm sorry I was late. I had difficulty signing in.
No worries. That was a popular experience or a common experience, I guess.
This is Sandra Erickson at Big Brothers Big Sisters in Fredericksburg. I really enjoyed my call with Samantha yesterday. Was just very excited. After that, I just had a question about if, say, you have an anchor organization, and I don't know if this is a Vista thing or a state thing, but I heard someone mention somewhere along the line that you would end up having to reimburse the anchor organization after a while or provide them funds. I don't know if I'm making that up, but or if that sounds familiar.
That's a great question. So for managing the planning grant specifically in and of itself, I would say that generally organizations will apply for funding for their own staff. So we don't see a lot of planning grant applications that require subgranting out money to other folks, it's definitely something we can talk about. If like, let's say Big Brothers Big Sisters and the Boys and Girls Club are trying to go in on an application together and fund staff positions at both organizations, we could talk about that for the planning grant purposes. I would say for organizations that are in their planning grant training and looking at their operational grants, sometimes there are cost shares depending on how they want to go about their program's funding. So in the example that we had on the slide, where Literacy Lab is the organization that applies for funding and then places the members at partnering schools, they could, for example, say every school has to pay us $3,000 per member to help cover their cost match that they're required to provide as a part of their operational grant. So there are things like that sometimes programs can set up based on how they're funded, and we can work with you on a case-by-case basis to talk about what that looks like and how folks set that up. There's no requirement for any cost sharing between organizations involved in a grant, but we often do see that as a part of the intermediary models. I don't know if that answers your question, Sandra.
Yeah, I think it did. Thank you very much.
I would say also the only time that you should be paying a cost share is proof of match. So like not just paying a fee, it should go, because no organization applying for AmeriCorps should like be getting a cash fall, right? Like this is not like a money-making scheme. And if you are receiving a fee from an organization, it needs to be on you need to use it as match. It's like in the Code of Federal Regulations. And you can't just get a fee and, have a party. It needs to be supported as match. But I will say, if you're doing Vista, they grant out cost share positions and standard positions. So that there's also a cost there, but there's different models. So.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Sam, do you want to talk about match requirements for planning grants for the upcoming year?
Absolutely. So match for operational grants is on a schedule based on how long you are in the organization, in the portfolio and running an AmeriCorps program. So it starts at 24% for 3 years. Luckily, the planning grant doesn't necessarily count towards those years having AmeriCorps, because planning grants don't support members. So there is a requirement for planning grants to have a 24% match. However, this year is really probably the best year to apply for a planning grant, because we have American Rescue Plan dollars that we have to spend before, I believe, the end of 2025. And so for this next round, which will start September 2024, we have the opportunity to provide cash match replacement. And what that means is that the 24% that you're required to match, we will instead say, don't worry about it. We'll cover that 24% with additional federal dollars. So essentially this year, specifically, probably not in future years, your cash match requirement of 24% will be waived, and we'll just give you additional extra federal dollars to pay for whatever you need to pay for, which is nice. And that's also for operational, but it's a formula, and it's only up to like a certain percentage.
So when you do your planning grant budget, essentially you would say, 76% is going to be requested money from, your AmeriCorps application, and then the 24% required match, you would say, well, this is how we would do it, but we're also requesting cash match replacement. Your organization won't actually have to pay anything, and that you would receive the full 100% value of your grant budget reimbursed to you. So no money down.
Hi, this is Kim again with United Way of Central Virginia. I have a question about the match. Does the match have to be cash, or can it also be in other forms?
Sure. So we do take in-kind match. I will say, just from experience, that if you're going for an operational grant, and this is your first year, and you are required, your statutory requirement is 24%. It costs more than 24% to run a successful AmeriCorps program, with staffing, with gear, with member costs, etc. And you can do in-kind match, like supervisory time, and you can even do supervisory time as match for the planning grant. But you have to be careful with in-kind, and I mean, you're at United Way, so you're probably pretty familiar, but if you're doing in-kind match, you have to have reasonable and allocable, like, does it make sense that it costs this much, right? Or like time and effort reporting to support it. So just being cognizant of that, it's just a little bit more difficult, I would say, to use in-kind than use cash, but.
And how does that work for the planning grant? Can it
Sure.
be in kind? For example,
Mhm.
let's say we get somebody to donate us a building for the project.
For the project, yeah, that would be okay, but there's be some additional paperwork when it comes to the valuation of that and how much is actually going towards the use strictly for the AmeriCorps project. You know, it could be square footage. How do you measure that? But like Annalise said, so you can put that on your application and we'll ask like what match you would have. But ultimately, if you're looking just for cash match replacement, you know, ultimately you won't have to use that as match.
Okay, so cash is king.
Well,
And
no, not necessarily.
we would say that.
If you want to put down that is your match, we would just ask for backup documentation. I mean, it's not that cash is king. It's just like, and it's difficult because it's like, okay, how what am I going to use $240,000 on? You know, and if you do that, you know, what's the match? I think it's like $70,000 or something like that. And it's like, are we coming up with $70,000 in cash, or are we using in kind? And it's just easier to use in kind. So I mean, you just have to have the right paperwork. All about paperwork in the federal government, right? We're
And
gonna
we
say
kind of
something else?
just echo
That's scary.
the for planning grants, we encourage you to apply for cash match replacement. You know, we want to get the money out there, and so there's no incentive to not apply for cash match replacement. And
Gotcha.
then also for both operational and for planning grants, we'll work with you to build your operational budget, and so we'll be able to work with you on kind of like what the best sources of match are. If you're applying directly for an operational grant, then we will also go back to you during negotiations. If there's anything about your budget that isn't what we're looking for, we would go back to you and say like, hey, this is going to be challenging, or you know, this is what we would need to validate this as a match cost. So so for your budget, we always just say kind of like, you know, do your best. Don't worry. We'll come back
Thank
to you
you.
if there's any issues. And you don't have to worry about like just not hearing from us or not getting the grant or something like that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Barbara, did that answer your question about match requirements for planning grants? Basically, just ask us for money.
Yes, it did. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks. Any other questions? I know we've kind of run the gamut from like 30,000 feet to like 6 inches away from, you know, your AmeriCorps program. So we've covered a lot of ground, but wanted to see if there's any other thoughts out there.
Annalise, this is Susan Baxter.
Hey,
I had
Susan.
a question come from a potential anchor, and
Mhm.
what they were asking about was the timeline and cash flow. So, and you went over the timeline, but I'm still struggling a little bit from a cash flow standpoint. That their ask was if they put in for if they fill in the application in February, and that they're continuing to plan. They've planned enough for the application, but they're continuing to plan with the idea of that's the work that will be funded. When does that funding actually come in for a planning grant? Is that not until September and then they pay back? Or is it that how does that work? And that was their question from cash flow.
That's a great question. So their performance period is going to start September 1st. And so they're welcome to do whatever they would like to do on their, you know, quote unquote, on their own dime in the summer. But they wouldn't start kind of their like build out, you know, the planning grant would not support their staff time until September 1st. They would turn in their first periodic expense report or reimbursement request essentially on the 10th of October. And then we would get them their reimbursement by the end of October. So they would see their first check probably end of October, beginning of November for their time starting in September.
I'd also like to say that there's pre-award expenses that they can apply for. So we require a training in July and August that all of our portfolio has to attend. And so they can request that they get reimbursed for those costs and not just, on their own dime, but between, like what Annalise said, between, X date and September 1st, and their planning, then that would just be on their own until their contract, because we also have to contract them with procurement, would start September 1st.
So I'm wondering then in this particular case, if because they are looking to be ready to start the work, and the planning itself would go on through the spring and the summer. And so thinking that the planning grant was the one they should go after, but it's sounding like it may be go ahead and do the planning on your own, be ready then for an operational grant. And so go ahead and apply in February for the operational grant versus the planning grant. If in fact they're going to be planning, the thought was that what they would be paid for in the planning grant is actually the planning. But what we're hearing is that actually the planning begins in September. I mean, some initial planning, but the September timing is really when the planning would begin.
And yeah, Susan, we can, I'd love to talk more specifics, because I think that there's also two types of planning probably happening, of like, there's planning as far as like where members are going to serve and what they're going to do. But then there's also planning as far as like, okay, what's your internal controls for like tracking member living allowances, and how do you, what's your policy on suspending members if they're inactive? Like, so there's a planning as far as like your community impact, and then there's planning as far as your AmeriCorps program. And I wouldn't say that you necessarily have to do a planning grant to plan an AmeriCorps program well. We're happy to send along all of the resources that you would do in a planning grant. If there was interest in developing an operational grant or being operational grant ready by September, we're happy to help prepare organizations to do that. I would just also kind of give the caveat that AmeriCorps does have a lot of like rules and regulations. And so we usually spend 4 months with organizations hand in hand, kind of thinking through like, yeah, like what does your policies and procedures look like? How are you going to monitor your sites? Like all of that kind of stuff. And so if the organization wants to take it on their own, that's totally fine. But just kind of with that caveat that it's definitely a little bit deeper than just kind of like where a member is going to serve, and and getting them out there. And so we'd love to talk with you and that organization a little more specifically about what they have in place and what they would need to prepare in order to be a strong operational grant.
Yeah, just because it feels like there's a big gap in time from February planning enough of what we do to September of then we get started to the nuts and bolts planning. What happens from February to September?
So that's essentially just our grants process, and it's unfortunate, but it is, it kind of is the state system that we live within. And so what we normally recommend is from February to September that organizations are really kind of clarifying their community need, getting partners on board, kind of doing a lot of that landscape assessment, so that when we start in September, they're ready to design their program, because they know what the service sites are, right? They already have a sense of like how big they want their program to be. And we're happy to help in that February to September process as well. We're happy, it's not like, so once the RFA closes, we can be helpful again. So I would say from March to September, we're happy also to do, consultations with organizations that may be doing their own planning process. Yeah. And then I would also say that I often encourage planning grants to consider doing the planning grant from September to December. By December, you'll have a program design that you can use to apply for operational funding that would start the following September. That's a great time to hire your program director. And then you have that 8 months to get them all onboarded and ready and recruiting members for your program, so that when your operational funding starts September 1st, they have all the experience and knowledge that they need to, to get you started on the right foot.
Great, thanks.
I was going to say too, like if you're not applying for a planning grant and you're applying for an operational, that time in between, so we would notify folks that they got funded in May. So May through August is like, you got to recruit your members. Where are they going to go? Right? We got to get all the paperwork together, their member position descriptions, their contracts, their onboarding, their training. So it's like, and that would potentially be unpaid, right? Because your contract wouldn't start till September 1st, but all that lead up needs to happen in order for a member to like put their boots on the ground September 1st.
Yeah.
So
Great questions. Highly recommend planning grants. Definitely not required, but helpful.
Hi, Annalise and Samantha. I'm Betsy Archer. I work for Leading Age Virginia as our grants administrator. I just wanted to say hello, and I'll be reaching out individually, but I did have a question about eligibility. Just, it's kind of like the paperwork that goes with it, because we are the trade association, but we also have the 501c3 nonprofit. And so are we required to put it in the 501c3, or can it kind of be in either? I mean, obviously we're a non-government entity or a non-federal entity. So just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a new one for me, so I'll have to look it up. But
Okay.
yeah, I'm sure you would be eligible, but I'd have to double check about the trade association specifically.
Okay. Yeah, I'll send an email and we'll
Awesome.
get
Thanks,
something
Betsy.
set up to
Looking
talk.
forward to
Yeah.
it.
Thank you.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I will stick around for a little bit. So if anybody has any other questions or comments, feel free to hang out. But wanted to also kind of let folks get back to their Thursday. We will follow up with slides and last year's RFA and the link to set up a consultation.